Welcome to today's vlog, and I have with me today a very special guest, none other than the Reverend Douglas Brewer. Douglas is a friend of mine, good friend of Sue and I, and a retired Methodist minister. And Douglas has very kindly agreed to have a little conversation with him, between us, about his faith journey. So, Douglas, perhaps, first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to have this conversation.
Pleasure.
And perhaps we could start going back to your youth days. You told me recently that you were part of quite a big church youth group, and
Yes,
as part of that, something very significant happened. Tell us about that.
Yes, indeed. I'll just go back one step further.
Yeah.
My granny was my first Sunday school teacher, because she and her husband ran a mission, and my mum took me to her. And then my auntie, who went to the Methodist church, knew that I wanted to join the Boys Brigade, so she said, come to my church. So I went and I joined the Boys Brigade and had a great time. And it all grew, and we had a youth club of over 100 members.
Wow.
So it was really, really alive. And so in the course of planning, the youth club leader and the minister invited a deaconess to come and take the service on a Sunday morning. So the church was full, and she gave her message and was very impressive. And towards the end of what she said, I do feel that there may be those of you here in this lovely church who would think seriously about giving your lives to Jesus. And I think there was a bit of music and so forth. And she said, if there is anybody who feels that they are genuinely moved to make that commitment, come forward. So there was a pause. And then, of course, one or two people went forward, and more went and more went. I sat at the side against a radiator and didn't move. But I think about 15 people went forward.
Wow.
And she invited us to make a commitment. So I made my commitment beside the radiator. It wasn't on, it was a nice day. But that was the beginning of the journey.
Wonderful. So it's interesting how often older family members have a part to play in our faith journey, isn't it? As you've just said it. And then that particular moment, how old would you have been when that service happened?
I would have been 16, 17, wow. Possibly 18. Yeah.
Brilliant. So that was a really significant moment. And then tell us a little bit about how you felt later on, your call to the ministry.
Yes. So I went in, I did my 2 years in the National Service, in the RAF, and the chaplain there was jolly good. And he said, there was about 4 or 5 of us in a little group that he used to meet with us. And he said, lads, I'm going to take you for a walk. And we looked at him because we weren't allowed to go off camp. We went to the back of the camp, and he got a key, and we went through this gate, and we went for this walk. And as we went along, I was very conscious of the fact that it probably was a Roman road.
Wow.
And as I marched along, I fell in step with the soldiers, and emotionally and pictorially in my mind, I went back to the time of Jesus.
Wow.
And I said, I'm coming your way. I'm coming your way. So that's how it all started.
Yeah.
Then, so some years went by, and then I was in the building industry and trained as a carpenter and joiner. But the boss was a very nice man, and he wanted to develop me, I think, for working in his business.
Yeah.
And so I was sitting at my desk in the office where we were doing a job installing a new garage, and staring at the wall. And Jack came in and said, Douglas, I've passed your door twice, and you've been staring at the wall. What's on your mind? So I said, well, I think I need to talk to my minister about going into the ministry. He said, I know, your minister lives not far up the road. Go and see him.
Wow.
Which I did, sat in his chair, and that started the process.
Brilliant. So your boss was very supportive, wasn't he?
He was a very kind man.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So you told me also a little bit about a funny episode at Synod, Ministerial Synod, when you were giving your testimony.
Yes, that's right. I struggled with some of the exams, and I had a retired minister who helped me, but he wasn't actually terrific help, but he was just a lovely man who
Yeah.
encouraged. And so we had to go to Synod, and then there were 4 candidates, 2 who've remained, or 3 have remained lifelong friends.
Mm.
And I stood up, and the Synod could ask questions.
Yeah.
And someone turned, Mr. Chairman, I noticed that this gentleman did not do very well in one of the sections of the examination. Has he got something to say? So I said, well, I can only think I studied the other subjects to the detriment of that one. And the people in this lots of chaps in the cinema, oh boy, yes, he's in, let him in, we'll have him.
So you made an impression. Yeah, wonderful. And all the ministry years, and do you look back on the ministry years, active ministry years? Obviously, you're still in ministry, but active ministry years with fondness.
Definitely, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
When I left college, when I finished college, well, there was a note on the notice board which said, "Brewer, see me." So I went to see the assistant tutor, and he said, "Douglas," he said, "the Seamen's Mission in London need a chaplain."
Mm-hmm.
So I got a bit askance. I said, "I didn't know we had a Seamen's Mission." So the tutor leaned forward. He said, "Well, neither did I, Douglas." He said, "But I'll make an appointment for you to go and see the chappie in charge now, the minister in charge." So I went along, and it all worked out, and that was my first 3 years of ministry, chaplain to merchant seamen.
Brilliant. Now, I'm sure we could go on forever talking about the different places where you were a minister, but we're coming towards the end of our time. But I want to ask you, you mentioned your early training, and you love still working with wood, don't you?
Yes, indeed.
And tell me, is there a connection, do you think, between your faith, your Christian faith, and what you do with your wood?
Yes, definitely. I mean, perhaps someone will say, "Can you make me a cupboard or a drawer or a chest of drawers or whatever?" So you gather the wood together, measure it for size, and then gradually piece it together until you've got a final result, and a useful result. And I think, a faith journey has got to be like that, that there's lots of things to know, lots of things to put in place. And it's a real joy when they do come together and are in place, and you've got something to be proud of, but something that is going to be useful, hopefully, for the rest of your life.
Yeah. And you've got lots of items in your home that you've made, haven't you? And
Yes.
I'm sure in many people's homes, in our home, we've got a lovely candlestick you made for us.
Right.
And of course, you're following it in some ways in the footsteps of Jesus, who was known as a carpenter.
Yes, indeed. Yes, that's right.
That's wonderful. So I've got 2 final questions to ask you, Douglas. The first is this: what one piece of advice would you offer to someone in their life of being a disciple or follower of Jesus?
Well, I would say, please find a friend who you can be friends with at the point that anything that crops up, you can talk to them about it.
Yeah.
You need a pal.
Yeah.
to go, to go through the journey.
Yeah.
I mean, it's lovely to go to meetings and sessions and so forth and learn about the scriptures and all that Jesus taught and so forth. But at the end of the day, you've got to process what it actually means to you, and make it contemporary. What does it mean to you now, in your life now?
Wonderful. And I have to say, as you mentioned that you and your wife Hazel have been very good friends to Sue and myself while we've been here. And we really value your encouragement, your support, and your friendship.
Bless you.
And my final question is this: have you got a favourite Bible verse or passage, and why?
Yep, St. Paul did the job. You know, he actually took the fragments and began to make them a whole church. And he says in 1 Corinthians 13, meanwhile, these three remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. And when we look around the world at the moment, the absence of love in action is appalling. But on the other hand, the evidence of love in action is just fabulous, with people giving their lives up and doing all they can to help people. That for me is the key.
Wonderful. Douglas, thank you ever so much for this chat. I know we could have gone on for all day probably chatting about different aspects, but I really appreciate it, and God bless you and thank you.
Thank you.